Imagine waking up before dawn just to spend hours shaking warm milk in a wooden churn, with no guarantee it'll even work. In the quiet fog of a medieval morning, making butter wasn't a recipe. It was a test of patience, strength, and survival. Tonight, we drift into the life of a 13th century peasant, where butter came from aching arms, sour smells, and stubborn cream that refused to turn, until finally it did. If this slow churn of history helps calm your restless thoughts, dust, you're right where you belong. Tap that bell and subscribe, so you never miss another sleepy tale from the past. And tell me in the comments, have you ever made something from scratch that felt like magic? The first sound you would hear if you lived in medieval Europe and happened to be awake at the ungodly hour of 5 in the morning would not be the rooster's crow. It would not be the gentle lowing of cattle stirring in their stalls, nor the soft rustle of hay being disturbed by restless hooves. No, the first sound of the medieval dairy day was the creaking of wooden shoes against frost-hardened earth, the whisper of wool skirts brushing against stone thresholds, and the soft thud of wooden buckets being lifted from their hooks. See, pre-dawn darkness of a 13th century manor, when the world was still painted in shades of black and deep blue, the dairymaids were already moving. Their day began not with the sun, but in defiance of its absence. By 5 o'clock in the morning, when most of the world lay wrapped in the dreamless sleep of exhaustion, these women were pulling on their woolen stockings, wrapping their heads in linen wimples, and stepping out into the bitter morning air to begin the most physically demanding work of the agricultural calendar. The medieval dairy operation was not the romantic pastoral scene that later centuries would paint in their nostalgic reveries. It was a grueling, back-breaking enterprise that demanded precision, strength, and an almost superhuman tolerance for repetitive labor. Each dairymaid carried with her the weight of economic survival, not just her own, but that of the entire household. A single cow that lost her milk could spell disaster for a hard-pressed peasant family. The stakes were always high, the margin for error always thin. Picture, if you will, Agnes, a dairymaid working on a mid-sized manor in the English countryside, around 1250. She is 17 years old, though her hands are already gnarled from years of milking, her back already curved from countless hours bent over churns and washing tubs. Agnes rises in darkness every morning except Christmas Day and Easter Sunday. Even on feast days, the cows must be milked, for cattle do not observe the Christian calendar. Her first task, performed by the flickering light of a rush candle, is to gather her equipment, the three-legged milking stool that has been her companion for 3 years, carved from oak and worn smooth by constant use, the wooden bucket, its interior scarred by countless scrubbings with sand and salt, and the milk cans, heavy vessels that will become exponentially heavier as the morning progresses. Each piece of equipment represents not just a tool, but a vital link in the chain of survival. The walk to the cow byre in winter is particularly brutal. Medieval writers rarely lingered on such mundane details, but the archaeological evidence paints a picture of unrelenting hardship. The stone floors of cattle shelters, worn smooth by centuries of hooves, become treacherous sheets of ice in the depths of winter. The thatched roofs, designed to keep rain and snow from the animals, create a perpetual twilight even at midday. And the smell, a combination of fresh manure, wet straw, sour milk, and the musky warmth of cattle bodies, would assault the nostrils with an intensity that modern people can barely imagine. Agnes's charges await her, 12 dairy cows, each with her own temperament, her own quirks, her own capacity for making a simple task impossibly complicated. There is Brownie, who kicks at shadows and has once sent a full bucket of milk flying across the byre floor. There is Gentle, ironically named, who has a tendency to step deliberately on feet and seems to take pleasure in swishing her tail across freshly washed faces. And there is Old Nan, the matriarch of the herd, who gives the richest milk, but only if approached from the left side and only if spoken to in a particular tone of voice. The actual process of milking is deceptively simple to describe, but brutally difficult to execute. Agnes settles herself on her three-legged stool, positioning the wooden bucket between her knees and under the cow's udder. She places her hands on the warm teats, feeling for the familiar rhythm that will coax the milk down. The proper technique, passed down from mother to daughter for generations, requires a specific pressure and timing. Too gentle and the milk will not flow. Too rough and the cow will refuse to let down her milk, or worse, will express her displeasure with a well-placed kick. Each cow, depending on her size and the quality of her feed, will produce between 2 and 4 gallons of milk per day during her peak period from April through September. This means that Agnes, working with 12 cows, must extract between 24 and 48 gallons of milk every morning, and again every evening. At roughly 10 minutes per cow for an experienced milker, this represents 2 to 3 hours of continuous physically demanding work performed twice daily, 7 days a week, for 6 months of the year. But the real challenge is not the milking itself. It is everything that comes after. The milk must be carried from the byre to the dairy house, a journey that becomes increasingly treacherous as the wooden buckets grow heavy. A gallon of milk weighs approximately 8 pounds, and medieval milk buckets, being made of thick oak, added another 2 to 3 pounds to the load. Agnes might make this journey 6 or 8 times each morning, carrying anywhere from 30 to 50 pounds with each trip. The dairy house itself is a marvel of medieval engineering, designed specifically for the processing of milk and cream. Built of stone to maintain cool temperatures, with small windows to minimize exposure to light, and with carefully sloped floors to facilitate drainage and cleaning, the dairy house represents one of the most sophisticated food processing facilities of its time. Here, in this cool, dim space, the transformation of milk into butter and cheese begins. The first step in this transformation is separation. In an age before mechanical cream separators, this process relies entirely on gravity and time. Agnes pours the fresh milk into wide, shallow pans made of wood, or, if the household is prosperous, pewter. These pans must be absolutely clean. A single trace of old milk can sour an entire batch. The cleaning process alone requires hauling buckets of water from the well, heating it over the fire, and scrubbing each vessel with sand and salt until it gleams. The milk sits in these pans for 12 to 24 hours, during which time the cream slowly rises to the surface. This process cannot be rushed, cannot be mechanized, and cannot be ignored. Agnes must check the pans regularly, skimming off any debris that might have settled on the surface, adjusting the temperature by moving pans closer to or farther from the fire, and constantly vigilant against the signs of spoilage that can destroy hours of work in minutes. During the peak season, when all 12 cows are producing at their maximum capacity, Agnes might have 40 or 50 pans of milk in various stages of separation at any given time. Each pan must be monitored, each batch must be timed, and each decision about when to skim the cream requires years of experience and an almost intuitive understanding of the subtle signs that indicate optimal readiness. But even as Agnes tends to the current day's milk, she must also be processing yesterday's cream, yesterday's butter, and yesterday's buttermilk. The rhythm of dairy work is relentless, with each day's tasks building upon the previous day's work and laying the foundation for tomorrow's labor. There is no pause, no rest, no opportunity to catch up if she falls behind. the cows continue to produce milk regardless of whether Agnes is ready to process it. And milk is perhaps the most unforgiving of all foodstuffs. It spoils quickly, it spoils completely. And when it spoils, it takes with it not just the immediate loss of the milk itself, but all the potential butter, cheese, and buttermilk that might have been produced from it. As the morning progresses and the first pale light of dawn begins to filter through the small windows of the dairy house, Agnes finds herself racing against time in ways that modern food production cannot replicate. She must skim the cream from yesterday's milk before it sours. She must begin churning the cream that was skimmed 2 days ago before it passes its prime. She must check the butter that was churned 3 days ago to ensure it is properly preserved. And she must clean and prepare the equipment for today's milking, which will begin again in the evening. Yet for all this frantic activity, the actual pace of the work is dictated not by human urgency, but by the slow biological processes that govern the transformation of milk into butter. Cream cannot be rushed to rise. Butter cannot be forced to form faster than its natural rhythm allows. And in this tension between the desperate need for speed and the immutable requirements of time, Agnes finds herself caught in a web of anxiety. That defines medieval dairy work. What happens, one might wonder, when this carefully orchestrated system breaks down? What occurs when a cow falls ill and stops producing milk, when a batch of cream refuses to churn, when the weather turns so cold that the dairy house becomes a frozen wasteland where milk turns to ice before it can be processed? These are the questions that haunted medieval dairymaids as they worked in their cold, dim dairy houses. Questions that would shape not only their daily routines, but the very structure of medieval agricultural society. The repetitive nature of the lifting and carrying takes an inevitable toll on her body. Medieval skeletons recovered by archaeologists consistently show signs of severe arthritis and spinal damage in individuals who performed heavy manual labor. The constant bending, lifting, and twisting required by dairy work creates particular patterns of wear on the joints and spine. Agnes, at 17, already experiences morning stiffness that requires several minutes of careful movement before. Her back and shoulders function normally, but the physical pain is only one dimension of the burden she carries. The psychological pressure of dairy work in a subsistence economy is perhaps even more crushing than the physical demands. Every decision she makes throughout the day has immediate and potentially catastrophic consequences. If she misjudges the timing of cream separation, an entire day's milk production is lost. If she fails to maintain proper cleanliness in her equipment, bacterial contamination can destroy not just current batches, but contaminate future production. If she miscalculates the temperature or humidity requirements for butter storage, weeks of accumulated product can spoil overnight. Modern food production systems include multiple safety nets, refrigeration to slow spoilage, preservatives to extend shelf life, insurance to protect against losses, and alternative supply chains to replace contaminated products. Medieval dairy production offers none of these protections. Agnes works without a safety net, and she knows that a single serious mistake can mean the difference between a family that eats butter throughout the winter and one that goes without this essential source of calories and vitamins. The economic pressure is intensified by the seasonal nature of dairy production. Cows produce milk only during the period from April through September, when fresh grass is available for grazing. During these 6 months, Agnes must produce enough butter and cheese to last the entire year. This means that she cannot afford even a single day of suboptimal production. Every gallon of milk that spoils, every batch of cream that fails to churn, every pound of butter that goes rancid represents not just an immediate loss, but a reduction in the family's food security for the coming winter. The preservation of dairy products in an age without refrigeration requires techniques that are both labor-intensive and resource-demanding. Salt, the primary preservative available to medieval households, is expensive and difficult to obtain in sufficient quantities. The salting process itself requires careful attention to ratios and timing. Too little salt, and the butter spoils. Too much salt, and it becomes inedible. Agnes must also maintain clean, dry storage containers, monitor temperature and humidity levels, and regularly inspect stored products for signs of spoilage. As she contemplates old Nan's blood-streaked milk, Agnes realizes that this crisis represents more than just the loss of one cow's production. It disrupts the careful timing that governs every aspect of dairy work. The time she must spend examining and treating old Nan is time stolen from processing yesterday's cream. The delay in processing yesterday's cream means that tomorrow's churning schedule will be disrupted. The disruption in tomorrow's churning means that next week's butter production will be reduced. In the interconnected web of dairy production, a single problem creates ripple effects that extend far beyond its immediate impact. The broader context of Agnes's work includes responsibilities that extend beyond the dairy house itself. Medieval women were expected to manage not only milk production, but also the care and feeding of poultry, the cultivation of household gardens, the preservation and preparation of food, the production of textiles, and the care of children. The dairy work, demanding as it is, represents only one component of a workload that modern people would find impossible to sustain. During harvest season, when the men are occupied with grain crops, the women must continue their dairy work, while also participating in the harvest, preparing meals for the increased workforce, and processing the grain for storage. During winter, when fresh food becomes scarce, they must carefully ration the preserved dairy products while maintaining the breeding program that will ensure adequate milk production for the following year. During calving season, they must provide round-the-clock care for newborn animals while continuing their regular dairy routine. The social isolation of this work adds another layer of difficulty. While men often work in groups during planting and harvest, dairy work is typically performed alone or with minimal assistance. Agnes spends most of her working hours in solitude, with only the cows and her own thoughts for company. The dairy house, designed for optimal food processing, is not designed for human comfort. It is cold, damp, and poorly lit. The work surfaces are at heights that require constant bending. The stone floors are hard on feet and legs. The small windows necessary to control light and temperature create a perpetual twilight that can be psychologically oppressive. Yet perhaps the most crushing aspect of Agnes's work is the knowledge that no matter how skillfully she performs her duties, no matter how carefully she tends her equipment, no matter how diligently she monitors her processes, she remains vulnerable to forces beyond her control. Weather, disease, economic fluctuations, and political instability can destroy in days or weeks what has taken months or years to build. The butter she produces today might be confiscated tomorrow as part of the Lord's tax obligation. The techniques she has spent years perfecting might prove inadequate against a new strain of bovine disease. The carefully maintained herd might be slaughtered to feed soldiers passing through the manor. Standing in the dim dairy house, holding old Nan's contaminated milk, Agnes faces a decision that encapsulates the fundamental challenge of medieval life. How to continue working when the work itself offers no guarantee of success, no promise of security, and no assurance that tomorrow's efforts will be any more successful than today's. But what other choice does she have, and how will this single moment of crisis ripple through the weeks and months to come? 3 days after old Nan's milk first showed signs of blood, Agnes finds herself working by candlelight at 11 o'clock. At night, desperately trying to salvage what she can from a week that has gone catastrophically wrong. The flickering light casts dancing shadows across the dairy house walls, transforming familiar equipment into menacing shapes that seem to mock her exhaustion. Her hands, raw from constant washing and exposure to salt water, move with mechanical precision through tasks she could perform blindfolded, but her mind races with calculations that would challenge a monastery's bookkeeper. Old Nan, it turned out, has mastitis, an infection that has not only stopped her milk production entirely, but threatens to spread to other cows in the herd. Agnes has spent precious hours every day examining udders, monitoring temperatures, and administering the only treatments available to her. Poultices made from various herbs, constant washing with water that must be hauled and heated, and the kind of desperate prayers that medieval people offered when human knowledge reached its limits. 2 other cows are showing early symptoms, and if the infection spreads further, the consequences will extend far beyond this year's butter production. The mathematics of her situation are stark and unforgiving. With old Nan out of production, and 2 other cows producing significantly less milk due to stress and early-stage infection, Agnes's daily milk yield has dropped from an average of 36 gallons to 22 gallons. This represents a loss of nearly 40% her raw material. But the impact on butter production is even more severe because cream production does not decrease proportionally with milk production. Stressed and infected cows produce milk with lower butterfat content, meaning that the remaining milk yields significantly less cream per gallon. Under normal circumstances, Agnes would expect to produce approximately 12 pounds of butter per week during peak season. With the current crisis, she is struggling to produce 7 pounds per week, and the quality of even this reduced output is compromised. Butter made from the milk of stressed animals has a different texture, a shorter storage life, and a tendency to develop off flavors more quickly than butter produced under optimal conditions. The timing of this crisis makes it particularly devastating. She is now 6 weeks into the peak production season, which means she should have accumulated approximately 72 pounds of preserved butter to help sustain the household through winter. Instead, she has managed to preserve only 43 pounds, and some of this early production is already showing signs of rancidity that will require immediate consumption rather than long-term storage. Medieval households operated on what modern economists would recognize as just-in-time inventory systems, not by choice but by necessity. Storage space was limited, preservation techniques were imperfect, and capital was too scarce to allow for significant surpluses. Agnes's family needs approximately 120 pounds of butter to sustain them through the non-production months from October through March. This figure is not arbitrary. It represents careful calculations based on nutritional needs, preservation losses, and the butter required for trade or tax obligations. At her current reduced production rate, Agnes will be able to preserve perhaps 85 pounds of butter by the end of the season, assuming no further losses to spoilage, infection, or other unforeseen problems. This shortfall of 35 pounds represents more than just inconvenience. It represents a direct threat to survival. Butter is not merely a luxury or flavoring agent in medieval diet. It is one of the few readily available sources of concentrated calories and essential fatty acids. During the lean months of late winter and early spring, when grain stores run low and fresh food is not yet available, butter can mean the difference between adequate nutrition and slow starvation. The broader implications of her production crisis extend beyond immediate food security. Butter serves multiple functions in the medieval economy that modern people rarely consider. It is a trade good that can be exchanged for other necessities, a form of wealth storage that retains value better than many alternatives, and a crucial component in food preservation techniques that extend the utility of other foodstuffs. Agnes's reduced butter production means reduced trade opportunities, less food preservation capacity, and decreased household economic flexibility at a time when such flexibility is most desperately needed. The physical toll of working longer, hours to compensate for reduced production, is becoming increasingly apparent. Agnes now rises at 4:30 in the morning instead of 5 o'clock, attempting to squeeze additional processing time from each day. She works until nearly midnight, cleaning equipment, monitoring stored products, and preparing for the next day's work. This schedule allows her only 4.5 hours of sleep per night, and the effects of chronic sleep deprivation are beginning to compound the physical stress of her work. Her nutrition is also suffering as she dedicates more time to production and less time to food preparation. Medieval dairy workers typically consumed significant quantities of buttermilk, which provided essential nutrients and calories to support their demanding physical labor. But buttermilk is a byproduct of butter production, and with reduced butter production comes reduced buttermilk availability. Agnes finds herself operating on fewer calories at precisely the time when her work demands have increased. The social dimensions of her crisis add another layer of complexity. Word of the mastitis outbreak has reached other households in the Ida manor, and Agnes finds herself subjected to both sympathy and scrutiny from neighbors who are deeply concerned about the possibility of infection spreading to their own herds. Medieval communities were tightly interconnected, and problems that affected one household's food production were viewed as potential threats to community stability. Some neighbors have offered assistance in the form of additional labor or shared resources, but accepting such help creates obligations that must eventually be repaid. Others have suggested folk remedies or magical interventions that Agnes knows to be ineffective but cannot openly reject without causing social friction. The delicate balance of community relationships requires her to appear grateful for all offers of help while privately making decisions based on practical rather than social considerations. The psychological pressure of working alone with problems that seem to grow larger with each passing day has begun to manifest in ways that Agnes is only beginning to recognize. She finds herself checking and rechecking work that she has performed correctly thousands of times, driven by an anxiety that she might make an error that would compound her existing problems. She startles at sudden noises, jerks awake from her. Brief periods of sleep convince that she has forgotten some crucial task, and experiences moments of panic when contemplating the approaching winter. Medieval people were not strangers to hardship, but the particular combination of physical exhaustion, economic pressure, and social responsibility that defines Agnes's situation represents a form of stress that few modern people have experienced. There are no social safety nets, no emergency services, no insurance policies or government programs to provide assistance when individual effort proves insufficient. Success or failure depends entirely on her ability to continue working effectively. Despite deteriorating conditions and diminishing resources, as she works through her third consecutive night of emergency dairy processing, Agnes begins to understand why so many medieval women died young, why so many families failed to survive. Difficult seasons, and why the production of something as simple as butter could become a matter of life and death. The romantic image of medieval rural life, popularized in later centuries, bears no resemblance to the grinding reality of subsistence agriculture, where every decision carries potentially fatal consequences and every day demands superhuman effort, simply to maintain the status quo. The candle burns lower, casting dimmer light across her work surface as Agnes continues the precise movements required to separate cream, wash butter, and prepare equipment for tomorrow's milking. She knows that in 5 hours she must be back in the cow byre, beginning another day of the same exhausting routine. She knows that her current pace is unsustainable, that something must give way soon. But she also knows that she has no choice but to continue, that the alternative to this grinding labor is not rest, but disaster. The question that keeps her moving through the small hours of the night is not whether she can maintain this pace indefinitely. She knows she cannot. The question is whether she can maintain it long enough to salvage adequate butter production for winter, whether the mastitis outbreak can be controlled before it destroys the entire herd, and whether the accumulated stress of this crisis will leave her with enough strength to face whatever challenges the remainder of the season might bring. These are the calculations that occupy her mind as she works alone in the flickering candlelight, racing against time, disease, and the inexorable approach of winter. In the pre-dawn darkness of a September morning in 1267, Grit of Wessex stands before the most feared piece of equipment in her dairy house, the butter churn. It is a simple device, deceptively so, little more than a tall wooden barrel fitted with a heavy plunger that must be lifted and dropped for hours on end until cream transforms into butter. Yet this humble contraption has been the instrument of more tears, more frustration, and more physical agony than any other tool in the medieval kitchen. The churn stands 4 feet high, made from oak staves bound with iron hoops that have been hammered by the local blacksmith from precious iron that cost Margaret's household the equivalent of 2 weeks' worth of grain. The wood has been carefully selected for its tight grain and impermeability to liquids, but even the finest oak will eventually absorb the fats and acids from repeated butter-making sessions, gradually developing a rancid smell that no amount of scrubbing can completely eliminate. This particular churn has been in Margaret's family for 12 years, inherited from her mother-in-law, along with the accumulated wisdom and superstitions that surround its use. The plunger itself is a work of crude engineering, a wooden paddle, attached to a long handle that must be precisely sized to fit through the narrow opening at the top of the churn while providing sufficient surface area to agitate the cream effectively. Too small, and the cream will never properly separate into butter. Too large, and the physical effort required will exceed human capability. The handle is worn smooth by countless hands, stained dark with sweat and cream, and marked with small notches that serve as timing guides for the various stages of the churning process. Margaret has been awake since 4 o'clock, skimming cream from the shallow pans where yesterday's milk has been slowly separating throughout the night. The cream, thick and yellowish white, carries the sweet, faintly nutty aroma that indicates optimal ripeness for churning. Too fresh, and it will not churn properly. Too aged, and it will produce butter with an unpleasant sour taste. The timing of this process cannot be rushed or delayed. Cream waits for no one, and Margaret has learned through painful experience that missing the optimal window can mean the difference between successful butter production and hours of wasted effort. She pours the cream into the churn, filling it approximately 1/3 full. This ratio is critical. Too little cream, and the plunger will not work effectively. Too much cream, and the churning will become impossible as the volume increases during the initial stages of agitation. The cream settles into the bottom of the churn with a soft, sloshing sound that Margaret has learned to interpret like a musical note. The pitch and rhythm of this sound will change throughout the churning process, providing auditory cues that guide her efforts when visual inspection becomes impossible. The physical act of churning begins with what seems like simple, repetitive motion. Lift the plunger, drive it down through the cream, lift it again, drive it down again. But this apparent simplicity conceals a complex choreography of timing, pressure, and endurance that requires years to master. The rhythm must be steady but not mechanical, forceful but not violent, sustained but not desperate. Margaret has developed her own internal cadence, a mental song that helps her maintain the proper pace. Come, butter, come, Peter's standing at the gate, waiting for a buttered cake. The words repeat endlessly in her mind, their familiar rhythm serving as both metronome and psychological anchor during the long hours of churning. This particular song was taught to her by her grandmother, who claimed it was passed down from her grandmother, who had learned it from her grandmother before that. The specific words matter less than the rhythm they provide, a rhythm that has been tested by generations of women who discovered through trial and error the precise tempo that coaxes cream into butter. The first hour of churning is the most deceptive. The cream appears to respond eagerly to the plunger's action, foaming and swirling with apparent progress. Margaret's arms feel strong, her back straight, her grip firm on the smooth wooden handle. The work seems manageable, even pleasant, accompanied by the soft thudding of the plunger and the gentle splash of cream against the sides of the churn. It is easy, during this initial period, to believe that butter making is a simple task that requires nothing more than patience and persistence. But the cream is deceptive. What appears to be progress during the first hour is merely the mechanical incorporation of air into the liquid, creating volume and foam, but not the fundamental molecular change that transforms cream into butter. The fat globules remain suspended in the liquid, requiring continued agitation to break down their protective membranes and allow them to coalesce into the solid mass that will eventually become butter. This process cannot be hurried, cannot be simplified, and cannot be accomplished through any means other than sustained physical effort. As the second hour begins, Margaret's arms begin to register the first complaints of overuse. The plunger, which seemed comfortably weighted during the initial stages, now feels heavier with each stroke. Her shoulders, which began the morning loose and flexible, now carry a persistent ache that deepens with each repetition. The rhythm that felt natural and sustainable an hour ago now requires conscious effort to maintain. The cream itself seems to resist her efforts with increasing stubbornness, requiring more force to achieve the same degree of agitation. The dairy house around her gradually fills with the pale light of dawn, but Margaret cannot pause to appreciate the changing light or to rest her increasingly tired arms. Interrupting the churning process, even briefly, can allow the cream to settle and separate in ways that make the formation of butter more difficult or even impossible. Once begun, the churning must continue until completion, regardless of physical discomfort, mechanical difficulties, or external circumstances. By the third hour, the deceptive ease of the early morning has been replaced by grinding physical reality. Margaret's hands, despite years of calluses built up from similar work, are beginning to blister where the wooden handle rubs against her palms. Her arms shake with fatigue between strokes, and she must consciously force herself to maintain the proper rhythm. The cheerful internal song that guided her early efforts has been replaced by more desperate counting. 147, 148, 149. The cream itself has begun to change in ways that are both encouraging and frustrating. Instead of the smooth, uniform liquid she started with, the contents of the churn now show distinct signs of separation. Small lumps of what will eventually become butterfloat in a thinner liquid that will become buttermilk. But these changes, while indicating progress, also make the physical work more difficult. The plunger now encounters resistance with each stroke, requiring additional force to push through the thickening mixture. Margaret's entire body has become involved in the churning process. What began as arm and shoulder work now engages her back, legs, and core muscles as she struggles to generate sufficient force to continue the agitation. She shifts her weight from foot to foot, seeking relief for muscles that are beginning to cramp from maintaining the same position for hours. Her breath comes in short, controlled bursts, timed to the rhythm of the plunger. Sweat, despite the cool temperature of the dairy house, runs down her face and soaks through her woolen undergown. The sounds from within the churn have changed as well. The soft sloshing of liquid has given way to a more solid thumping as the plunger encounters increasing resistance. This acoustic feedback provides crucial information about the progress of the churning, but it also serves as a psychological reminder of how much work remains. The rhythm of sound and motion has become hypnotic, creating an altered state of consciousness that is part meditation, part endurance test, and part desperate prayer. As the fourth hour approaches, Margaret begins to experience the phenomenon that medieval dairy workers knew as the despair. This is the point at which the physical pain becomes so intense, the progress so imperceptible, and the end so distant, that many novice buttermakers simply abandon their efforts. The cream appears to mock her continued exertions, showing tantalizingly small signs of butter formation, but refusing to complete the transformation that would justify the agony she has endured. Her hands are now bleeding where the blisters have burst and reformed. Her arms tremble uncontrollably between strokes, and she must grip the plunger handle with both hands to maintain control. The muscles in her back have progressed beyond pain into a kind of numbness that she knows will torment her for days after. The churning is complete, yet she cannot stop, cannot rest, cannot even slow her pace without risking the loss of hours of work and precious cream that cannot be replaced. The medieval world offers no alternatives to this grinding physical ordeal. There are no mechanical aids, no shortcuts, no technological solutions that can reduce the human effort required to transform cream into butter. The work must be done by hand, by sustained human effort, or it cannot be done at all. Margaret's arms, shoulders, and back are the only machinery available for this essential food production process, and their failure would mean not just personal disappointment, but household catastrophe. As she struggles through the fourth hour of churning, Margaret becomes acutely aware of the broader context of her suffering. Every woman in her village, every dairy worker throughout medieval Europe, faces this same ordeal whenever butter must be made. There is no escape from the physical demands, no way to delegate the work to others without creating corresponding hardships for them. The production of butter, one of the most basic and essential foods in the medieval diet, requires a level of physical sacrifice that modern people can barely comprehend. The folklore surrounding buttermaking includes numerous stories of women who collapsed from exhaustion during churning, of churns that had to be finished by multiple people working in shifts, of entire households that went without butter because no one could endure the physical demands of its production. These stories, passed down through generations of women, serve not just as entertainment but as warnings about the genuine dangers of this seemingly simple task. Margaret's grandmother had told her about the winter of 1243, when a late harvest delayed the final butter-making of the season until the weather turned cold. The dairy house became so frigid that the cream thickened beyond normal consistency, requiring nearly 6 hours of churning to produce butter. 3 women in the village attempted the task and failed to complete it, losing not only their immediate efforts but their entire supply of cream for winter butter production. The 4th woman, Margaret's great-aunt, succeeded only by building a fire in the dairy house and churning in shifts with her teenage daughter, but the effort left her bedridden for a week with exhaustion and muscle damage. Such stories were not unusual. The physical demands of medieval buttermaking regularly pushed human endurance beyond its limits, and the consequences of failure extended far beyond individual discomfort. Families that could not produce adequate butter faced nutritional deficiencies, reduced trade opportunities, and increased vulnerability to the economic uncertainties that characterized medieval life. As the sun reaches its zenith and Margaret enters her 5th hour of churning, she begins to understand why butter was considered such a precious commodity, why it commanded high prices in medieval markets, and why its production was surrounded by such elaborate folklore and superstition. The sheer physical agony required to create this basic food product meant that every pound of butter represented not just nutritional value, but human suffering on a scale that modern industrial food production has completely eliminated. Yet even as her body screams for relief, even as her vision blurs with exhaustion and her hands leave bloody prints on the wooden handle, Margaret cannot allow herself to consider failure. Too much depends on her success, too many people rely on the butter she produces, and too much of the household's winter survival strategy depends on her ability to endure whatever pain is necessary to complete this task. But what happens when the human body reaches its absolute limits? What occurs when the physical demands of butter making exceed even the most determined efforts? These are the questions that haunt Margaret as she struggles through her 5th hour of churning, questions that will soon be answered in ways she cannot yet imagine. At 4 hours and 37 minutes into her churning session, Margaret's left arm simply stops working, not gradually, not with warning, but with the sudden finality of a rope snapping under too much weight. The plunger, which she has been lifting and dropping with mechanical precision for nearly 5 hours, suddenly becomes impossibly heavy. Her grip fails and the wooden handle slips from her bloodied fingers, sending the plunger crashing down into the churn with a force that splashes thick cream across the walls of the dairy house. For a moment, Margaret stands frozen in disbelief. Her left arm hangs uselessly at her side, the muscles apparently having decided that they will no longer respond to her brain's increasingly desperate commands. The pain that has been building throughout the morning has suddenly transformed into something beyond mere discomfort, a deep, bone-deep agony that seems to radiate from her shoulder down through her fingertips. She tries to lift her arm, to resume her grip on the plunger handle, but the limb responds with nothing more than a faint tremor. Medieval medicine offers no understanding of what modern doctors would diagnose as acute muscle fatigue, repetitive strain injury, and the onset of rhabdomyolysis, a condition in which overworked muscles begin to break down and release proteins into the bloodstream that can damage the kidneys. Margaret knows only that her body has betrayed her at the worst possible moment, when the cream in the churn has finally begun to show clear signs of butter formation, and abandoning the process now would mean losing not just today's work, but several days' worth of carefully accumulated cream. She examines her left hand, noting with detached fascination that her fingers have curled into a permanent grip shape as if they are still holding the plunger handle. When she tries to straighten them, sharp pains shoot up her arm and across her shoulder blade. Her palm, raw and bleeding from the constant friction of the wooden handle, has begun to swell in a way that suggests deeper tissue damage. The calluses that have protected her hands through years of similar work have been worn completely away, leaving exposed flesh that stings with every movement. The contents of the churn demand her immediate attention. The cream has reached the crucial stage, where butter formation is imminent but not yet complete. If she can continue churning for perhaps another hour, the transformation will be complete and she will have produced the 12 to 15 pounds of butter that represent a week's worth of successful dairy work. If she stops now, the partially churned cream will be unusable, too far progressed to return to its original state, not sufficiently processed to yield butter. Margaret attempts to continue churning with her right arm alone, but the effort proves immediately impossible. The plunger, designed to be operated with both hands, becomes unwieldy and ineffective when operated with only one. The reduced leverage means that she cannot generate sufficient force to continue the agitation process. Even worse, the unbalanced motion threatens to tip the churn over, which would not only waste the cream, but potentially damage the expensive wooden container that represents a significant portion of her household's capital investment. The next option she considers is recruiting, help from other members of her household, but this solution brings its own complications. Her husband and sons are in the fields harvesting the last of the barley before the weather turns. Her daughters are occupied with their own essential tasks, food preparation, textile work, and care of the younger children. Everyone in the household operates at the edge of their physical capacity during harvest season, and asking someone to abandon their work to assist with churning means that some other essential task will go undone. Moreover, butter churning is considered women's work, and asking men to participate would violate social conventions in ways that could have consequences extending far beyond the immediate crisis. Medieval gender roles were not merely customs, but essential organizational principles that governed the distribution of labor and resources within households and communities. Disrupting these roles, even in emergencies, could create social tensions that would outlast the immediate problem. Margaret's mother-in-law, who lives in the same household and has decades of churning experience, suffers from arthritis that has progressively worsened over the past several years. Her hands, gnarled and painful, can no longer grip the plunger handle effectively, and her shoulders lack the strength to sustain the repetitive motion required for successful churning. She can provide advice and moral support, but the physical work must be done by someone else. This leaves Margaret with a decision that encapsulates the cruel mathematics of medieval life. She can abandon the churning and accept the loss of several days' worth of cream, or she can continue working despite her physical limitations and risk permanent injury that could affect her ability to work for weeks or months to come. Both options carry potentially catastrophic consequences for her family's winter food security. She chooses to continue, switching to a modified technique that distributes the work differently across her body. Instead of the traditional two-handed grip, she wraps her right arm around the plunger handle and uses her entire torso to generate the motion needed for churning. This approach is less efficient and more exhausting, but it allows her to continue the process while giving her damaged left arm time to recover. The modified churning technique transforms the work from a primarily arm and shoulder exercise into a full-body ordeal. Margaret must engage her core muscles, legs, and back to generate sufficient force to continue the agitation process. The motion becomes less precise, less controlled, and more dependent on brute force than skillful technique. The rhythm that had sustained her through the early hours of churning breaks down, replaced by irregular, desperate movements that barely maintain the minimum agitation necessary for butter formation. As she struggles with her improvised technique, Margaret becomes acutely aware of the sounds coming from neighboring dairy houses. Through the thin walls of her workspace, she can hear the steady, rhythmic thumping of other women's churns, the consistent beat that indicates successful, sustainable churning technique. The contrast between their steady progress and her own erratic effort serves as a constant reminder of her physical limitations and the precarious nature of her situation. The psychological impact of physical failure during crucial work becomes another burden to bear. Margaret has been churning butter for more than a decade, building a reputation within her community as a skilled and reliable dairy worker. Her butter has won praise at local markets, her techniques have been copied by younger women, and her success has contributed to her family's economic stability. The current crisis threatens not just immediate production, but her long-term standing within the community. Medieval rural communities operated on networks of reciprocal obligation and mutual dependence that required each household to contribute its share of essential production. A family that could not fulfill its dairy obligations might find itself excluded from cooperative work arrangements, trade relationships, and social support systems that were essential for survival. Margaret's current physical limitations threaten not just her own family's welfare, but their integration into the broader community structures that made rural life possible. The pain in her left arm has evolved from acute muscle fatigue into something deeper and more persistent. What began as simple exhaustion has progressed into a condition that medieval people would have recognized as a form of injury but could not effectively treat. The constant, repetitive motion has created microscopic tears in muscle fibers, inflammation in joints, and stress fractures in bones that will require weeks of rest to heal properly. But rest is a luxury that harvest season does not permit. As Margaret continues her modified churning technique, she becomes aware of a new set of physical problems developing. The altered body mechanics required by her improvised method place unusual stress on her lower back, creating a deep ache that radiates down her right leg. Her right arm, now doing work originally designed for two arms, shows signs of approaching the same failure point that disabled her left arm. The muscles in her neck and shoulders, strained by the unnatural posture required for single-arm churning, send shooting pains across her upper back with increasing frequency. The cream in the churn, meanwhile, continues its slow transformation, regardless of Margaret's physical distress. The partial butter formation that was visible an hour ago has progressed to the point where distinct lumps of butter float in increasingly clear buttermilk. The process is nearing completion, but the final stage requires the most vigorous agitation of the entire churning process. The butter must be forced to coalesce into a single mass, and the buttermilk must be thoroughly separated to ensure proper preservation of the final product. This final stage typically requires the most sustained physical effort of the entire churning process precisely at the moment when Margaret's body is least capable of providing it. Her right arm, stressed beyond its normal limits, begins to show the same trembling and weakness that preceded the failure of her left arm. Her grip on the plunger handle becomes increasingly unreliable, and she must pause frequently to flex her fingers and restore circulation to her hands. The question that now dominates Margaret's thoughts is not whether she can complete the churning successfully, but whether she can complete it at all before her body fails entirely. The stakes could not be higher, the margin for error could not be smaller, and the physical resources available to her could not be more limited. Yet somehow she must find a way to continue, because the alternative is not merely failure but disaster. How much punishment can the human body absorb before it simply refuses to continue? What happens when the essential work of survival exceeds the physical capabilities of the people who must perform it? These are the questions that medieval people faced regularly, and the answers were often written in pain, disability, and premature death. At 6 hours and 43 minutes, something impossible happens. The butter comes. Not gradually, not with the slow progression that Margaret had expected based on previous churning sessions, but suddenly and completely, as if the cream had been waiting for this precise moment of her greatest desperation to reveal its transformation. The sound from within the churn changes from the labored sloshing of thick liquid to the solid thump of butter striking wood, and the resistance against her plunger suddenly decreases as the buttermilk separates cleanly from the newly formed butter mass. Margaret's first reaction is not relief but suspicion. Medieval folklore is filled with stories of supernatural intervention in butter making, usually involving the devil or malevolent spirits who assist struggling dairy workers in exchange for their souls or their firstborn children. The sudden success after hours of agonizing failure feels too convenient, too perfectly timed to be entirely natural. She has heard the stories whispered among the women of her village, churning butter with the devil's help, making bargains with dark forces when human strength proves insufficient. Her grandmother's voice echoes in her memory. When the butter comes too easy, when the cream turns faster than it should, When your arms feel strong at the moment they should be weakest, that's when you know you're not churning alone. The old woman had spoken of dairymaids who accepted supernatural assistance during their darkest moments, only to discover that their butter spoiled within days, their cows stopped producing milk, or their families fell victim to mysterious illnesses. But as Margaret lifts the plunger and sees the golden butter clinging to its surface, she finds that she cannot bring herself to care about folklore or superstition. The butter is real, solid, and properly formed. It has the correct color, the right texture, and the sweet, clean smell that indicates successful churning, whether it was produced through natural processes or supernatural intervention seems irrelevant compared to the immediate reality of her success. The physical relief of completing the churning is so intense that it borders on euphoria. Her tortured muscles, pushed beyond their limits for nearly 7 hours, suddenly feel light and flexible. The pain that has dominated her consciousness for the past 2 hours fades to a manageable ache. Her grip on the plunger handle, which had become increasingly unreliable as exhaustion set in, feels secure and controlled. It is as if her body has been restored to its condition from the beginning of the morning, before the grinding hours of repetitive labor had worn her down to the point of collapse. She works quickly to complete the final stages of butter production, driven by a superstitious fear that the supernatural assistance, if that is what it was, might be withdrawn at any moment. The butter must be lifted from the churn, washed repeatedly in cold water to remove all traces of buttermilk, and then worked by hand to expel any remaining liquid that could cause spoilage. Each step requires careful attention and considerable physical effort, but Margaret finds herself moving through the tasks with an efficiency and strength that should be impossible after 7 hours of exhausting labor. The washing process reveals the true quality of her butter. As she kneads the golden mass in a wooden bowl filled with cold well water, the liquid runs clear after only 3 rinses, a sign that the butter formation was complete and thorough. Properly made, butter should require 5 or 6 washings before the water runs clear, but this batch seems to have achieved optimal separation between butter and buttermilk during the churning process itself. The final weight of her butter is even more surprising, 18 pounds, significantly more than the 12 to 15 pounds she had expected from the amount of cream she had used. Medieval buttermaking typically yields approximately 1 pound of butter for every 2 to 3 gallons of cream, but her batch has produced nearly double the expected output. The excess production represents not just immediate success, but additional food security for the coming winter months. As she begins the process of salting and storing her butter, Margaret cannot shake the feeling that she has paid a price for, her success that she does not yet understand. The folklore surrounding supernatural assistance in dairy work invariably includes delayed consequences, payments that come due weeks or months after the initial bargain, children who sicken and die, cows that refuse to produce milk, household accidents that seem to target the women who accepted forbidden help. She examines each pound of butter carefully as she wraps it in clean linen for storage, looking for signs of the supernatural taint that the old stories describe. But the butter appears perfect in every respect, properly colored, correctly textured, sweet-smelling, and firm to the touch. If there is anything unnatural about it, the evidence is not visible to human senses. The buttermilk, too, appears normal and wholesome. Medieval households typically consumed buttermilk fresh or used it in cooking and baking, and Margaret's batch has the characteristic tangy flavor and smooth consistency that indicate proper fermentation. She tastes it cautiously, alert for any unusual flavors that might suggest supernatural contamination, but finds only the familiar sourness that makes buttermilk such a valuable addition to the medieval diet. Her physical recovery from the exhausting Churning session is perhaps the most suspicious aspect of the entire experience. By all rights, she should be barely able to move after 7 hours of grinding physical labor. Her arms should be useless for days, her back should be locked in, spasm, and her hands should be too damaged to grip anything safely. Instead, she feels remarkably well. Tired, certainly, but not disabled. The pain that had been so intense just an hour ago has faded to a level that barely interferes with her movements. Medieval people understood that supernatural bargains often included immediate benefits that masked long-term costs. The devil was believed to be generous with short-term assistance, providing strength, skill, or success to those who needed it most desperately. But these gifts always came with prices that were revealed only after the immediate crisis had passed, when it was too late to reconsider the bargain. As afternoon fades into evening, Margaret completes her dairy work and begins preparing for the evening milking. Her cows, oblivious to the morning's drama, await their routine care with the patient expectation that has characterized livestock for centuries. She approaches each animal carefully, watching for signs of the mysterious illnesses that folklore associates with supernatural intervention in dairy work. Old Nan, the lead cow whose milk production has been most reliable throughout the season, seems healthy and content. Her udder shows no signs of infection or unusual sensitivity, and her milk flows normally during the evening milking. The younger cows, too, appear unaffected by whatever forces may have assisted in the morning's butter production. Their milk has the same color, consistency, and flavor that Margaret has come to expect from healthy, well-fed animals. But medieval superstition taught that supernatural consequences often took weeks or months to manifest fully. A cow that seemed healthy today might sicken tomorrow. Children who played happily in the evening might wake with mysterious fevers. Butter that seemed perfect at the time of production might develop rancid flavors that no amount of salt could prevent. Margaret finds herself caught between gratitude for her success and anxiety about its ultimate cost. The 18 pounds of butter she produced will significantly improve her family's prospects for surviving the winter. The physical recovery that allowed her to complete her other duties represents a form of blessing that she cannot deny. Yet, the circumstances of her success are so unusual, so perfectly timed, and so contrary to the natural progression of exhaustion and failure that she cannot dismiss the possibility of supernatural intervention. Medieval Christianity taught that accepting help from evil spirits was a mortal sin, but it also acknowledged that such help was often offered during moments of genuine desperation when human resources proved inadequate. The Church's position on supernatural assistance in daily labor was complex and sometimes contradictory, recognizing both the sinfulness of such bargains and the extreme circumstances that might drive otherwise faithful people to accept them. As she lies in bed that night, her body surprisingly comfortable after the day's ordeal, Margaret wrestles with questions that have no clear answers. Did she succeed through her own determination and skill, or did she accept help from forces that demanded a price she has not yet paid? Was her recovery a natural result of completing difficult work, or evidence of supernatural intervention to win her body's normal processes? Will her butter prove to be wholesome nourishment for her family, or will it carry a taint that reveals itself only after consumption? These questions will haunt her in the days and weeks to come as she watches her family, her livestock, and her stored butter for signs of the delayed consequences that medieval folklore associates with supernatural assistance. The price of her success may have been higher than she realizes, but the alternative, watching her family face winter without adequate food, makes even a bargain with the devil seem like a reasonable exchange. The medieval world offered its People few choices between certain disaster and uncertain salvation, and Margaret has chosen the path that offers at least the possibility of survival, regardless of its ultimate cost. In the late summer of 1289, Adelheid the dairymaid discovers that her greatest enemy is not the back-breaking labour of churning, not the unforgiving schedule of twice-daily milking, not even the constant threat of disease among her cattle. Her greatest enemy is time itself, and it has declared war on every pound of butter she manages to produce. She learns this harsh lesson when she opens a crock of butter that was made just 3 weeks earlier. Butter that should have been perfect, preserved in salt and stored in the coolest corner of her dairy house, only to find it transformed into a rancid grey-green mass that reeks of decay and renders weeks of agonizing labor completely worthless. The smell hits her first, a putrid combination of sour milk, rotting meat, and something indefinably corrupt that makes her stomach lurch and her eyes water. This is not the mild sourness that indicates butter past its prime, nor the slightly sharp odor that suggests minor spoilage. This is the unmistakable stench of complete bacterial decomposition, of food that has not merely aged but has become actively dangerous to consume. Adelheid stares at the ruined butter with a mixture of heartbreak and terror. Heartbreak, because those 3 pounds of butter represent nearly a full day's worth of churning, plus the milk from 6 cows over 2 days, plus the cream skimming, washing, salting, and careful storage that should have preserved it through the winter months. Terror, because this butter was meant to sustain her family through the lean period between October and April, when fresh dairy production ceases and stored food becomes the difference between survival and starvation. She lifts the crock to examine the butter more closely and immediately regrets the decision. The surface, which should be smooth and golden, is covered with a network of dark veins that look disturbingly like blood vessels. The edges, where the butter meets the ceramic walls of the crock, show patches of fuzzy mold in colors that nature never intended food to display: deep blues, sickly greens, and an alarming orange that seems to pulse with malevolent life. When she probes the mass with a wooden spoon, it gives way with the consistency of rotted cheese, releasing fresh waves of nauseating odor. The butter's texture provides additional evidence of the extent of its deterioration. What should be firm and slightly waxy has become soft and greasy, with pockets of liquid that appear to be some combination of melted fat and bacterial byproducts. The color has shifted from the healthy yellow of properly made butter to a grayish hue that suggests the complete breakdown of the natural compounds that give fresh dairy products their appealing appearance. Medieval people understood spoilage as a fact of life, but they did not understand the bacterial processes that cause it. Adelheid knows that her butter has gone bad, but she cannot comprehend the microscopic war that has been waged within the ceramic crock over the past 3 weeks. Bacteria, invisible to the naked eye and unknown to medieval science, have been steadily consuming the fats and proteins in her carefully preserved butter, transforming wholesome food into toxic waste through processes that seem as mysterious as they are devastating. The immediate question facing Adelheid is whether any of the ruined butter can be salvaged. Medieval households could not afford to waste food, even food that had begun to spoil. Techniques existed for removing mold from cheese, for using sour milk in cooking, and for converting spoiled grain into animal feed. But butter that has reached this level of decomposition presents no salvage opportunities. It cannot be cleaned, cannot be cooked to remove harmful bacteria, and cannot even be fed to livestock without risking their health. She scrapes the putrid mass into a wooden bucket, trying to breathe through her mouth to minimize exposure to the overwhelming stench. The butter comes away from the crock in chunks that seem to disintegrate as she handles them, leaving her hands coated with a greasy film that no amount of washing will completely remove. The smell clings to her clothing, her hair, and her skin, marking her with the distinctive odor of failed food preservation that medieval people recognized as one of the signs of approaching hunger. The economic impact of this loss extends far beyond the immediate value of the spoiled butter. Those £3 represented not just food, but a form of wealth storage that could be traded for other necessities, used to pay taxes or rent, or converted into other preserved foods through cooking. Medieval households operated on margins so thin that the loss of a single major food item could destabilize their entire survival strategy for the coming winter. Adelheid tries to trace the source of the spoilage, examining her preservation techniques for flaws that might have allowed bacteria to gain access to the supposedly protected butter. The salt she used was expensive but appeared to be of good quality, with the large, clean crystals that indicate proper evaporation and minimal contamination. The crock itself was clean, having been scrubbed with sand and scalded with boiling water before use. The butter had been properly washed to remove all traces of buttermilk, which could provide nutrients for bacterial growth. The storage location, too, had been carefully chosen. The corner of the dairy house where she kept her preserved butter was the coolest spot available, protected from direct sunlight and insulated by thick stone walls that maintained relatively stable temperatures. The crock had been covered with a clean linen cloth and sealed with a layer of additional salt to create a barrier against airborne contamination. By all medieval standards, her preservation technique had been flawless. Yet something had gone wrong, and the consequences of that failure now force her to confront the terrifying reality of food preservation in an age without refrigeration. No matter how carefully she follows traditional techniques, no matter how precisely she measures salt and monitors storage conditions, no matter how diligently she maintains cleanliness and hygiene, the fundamental biology of food, spoilage, remains beyond her control. The bacterial contamination that destroyed her butter could have come from anywhere. Microscopic organisms on her hands, despite careful washing, airborne spores that settled on the butter during processing, contaminated salt that appeared clean but harbored dangerous microbes, or even the ceramic crock itself, which might have retained bacteria in microscopic cracks despite thorough cleaning. Medieval people had no way to detect or eliminate these sources of contamination, leaving them perpetually vulnerable to spoilage losses that could destroy months of careful work in a matter of days. As Adelheid disposes of the ruined butter, she finds herself calculating the broader implications of her loss. She had planned to preserve approximately 40 pounds of butter to sustain her family through the winter months. If spoilage continues at the current rate, she will lose a significant portion of her stored food before the winter even begins. The remaining butter, stored in identical conditions using identical techniques, faces the same risk of bacterial contamination that destroyed the first batch. The psychological impact of food spoilage in a subsistence economy cannot be overstated. Modern people who lose food to spoilage face inconvenience and expense, but they can replace the lost food by visiting a grocery store. Medieval people who lost food to spoilage faced the prospect of hunger, malnutrition, and in extreme cases, starvation. The sight of ruined food represented not just wasted labor, but a direct threat to survival that triggered deep, primitive fears about security and mortality. Adelheid's hands shake as she cleans the empty crock, not from the physical demands of the work, but from the anxiety that accompanies the realization that her family's winter food security has been compromised by forces beyond her control. The same bacterial processes that destroyed her first batch of butter are likely at work in her remaining stored food invisible and unstoppable, gradually converting her carefully preserved supplies into toxic waste. Medieval preservation techniques, developed through centuries of trial and error, represented the best available knowledge for extending the life of perishable foods, but they were fundamentally limited by the lack of understanding about the microscopic organisms that cause spoilage. Salt could slow bacterial growth but could not eliminate it entirely. Cool storage could reduce the rate of decomposition but could not stop it completely. Clean handling could minimize contamination but could not prevent it absolutely. The result was a constant battle between human effort and natural processes, a battle that humans could sometimes win but never completely control. Every preserved food item represented a gamble against time and biology, with stakes that could not be higher and odds that could not be calculated. Medieval people lived with the constant knowledge that their food security depended on winning these gambles consistently, and that a single significant loss could mean the difference between survival and disaster. As evening approaches and Adelheid prepares for the day's final milking, she finds herself looking at her remaining stored butter with new eyes. Each crock, which yesterday represented security and success, now appears as a potential source of catastrophic loss. The same preservation techniques that she trusted completely just hours ago now seem inadequate and uncertain. The very act of storing food for future consumption has been revealed as a form of high-stakes gambling, with consequences that extend far beyond personal disappointment. But what alternative does she have? The cattle will stop producing milk in a few weeks, and without preserved dairy products, her family will face winter with inadequate nutrition and no buffer against the food shortages that characterize late winter and early spring. She must continue to preserve butter despite the risk of spoilage, must continue to trust in techniques that have already failed her, and must somehow find ways to improve her odds in a game where the rules are unknown and the stakes are life and death. 3 weeks after discovering her first spoiled butter, Adelheid makes a decision that will either save her family's winter food supply or mark her as a madwoman in the eyes of her neighbors. She will bury her remaining preserved butter in the bog that lies a quarter-mile from her village. The practice of bog burial for food preservation is whispered about among the women of her region, spoken of in hushed tones as either ancient wisdom or dangerous superstition, depending on the speaker's experience with its outcomes. The bog itself is a mysterious and forbidding place, avoided by most villagers except when necessity drives them to harvest peat for fuel. It stretches across several acres of low-lying ground, its surface deceptively solid-looking but treacherous underneath, where unwary travelers can sink into pockets of liquid mud that seem to appear without warning. The water that seeps through. The bog is dark and acidic, stained by centuries of decomposing plant matter that has created an environment unlike anything else in the medieval landscape. Local folklore attributes magical properties to the bog, claiming that time moves differently there, that objects buried in its depths are protected by supernatural forces, and that the bog itself is a gateway to otherworldly realms where the normal rules of decay and corruption do not apply. These stories are usually dismissed as peasant superstition by the educated classes, but they persist among the common people because they contain kernels of truth that medieval science cannot explain. Adelheid's decision to attempt bog burial is not based on folklore, but on practical observation. Old Magda, the wisest woman in the village, had mentioned during a conversation about food preservation that her grandmother used to bury butter in the bog during times of crisis, and that such butter could remain wholesome for years rather than months. The technique was apparently common during the time of the Viking raids, when families needed to hide their food supplies from marauding armies and could not risk storing them in easily discovered locations. The practical challenges of Bog burial begin with the selection of containers. The butter must be wrapped in materials that will protect it from direct contact with bog water while allowing the preservative effects of the bog environment to work. Adelheid chooses wooden barrels, small enough to carry but large enough to hold several pounds of butter each. She lines these barrels with animal hides that have been specially treated with salt and tallow to create a waterproof barrier. The preparation of the butter itself requires modifications to her standard preservation techniques. Instead of the usual salt and storage method, she creates a more complex preservation medium using salt, herbs, and animal fat in proportions that old Magda remembered from her grandmother's instructions. The mixture includes rosemary and thyme, both known for their preservative properties, plus rendered beef fat that will create an additional barrier against contamination. The physical process of bog burial proves to be far more demanding than Adelheid had anticipated. The selected burial site, located in a section of the bog that remains solid enough to support human weight, still requires careful navigation to avoid unstable areas where the ground might give way. She must carry the heavy barrels of butter across uneven terrain, through stands of bog grass that grow taller than her head, and around pools of dark water that reflect the sky like mirrors. The actual burial requires digging through layers of peat that become progressively wetter and more unstable as she goes deeper. The bog water seeps into the hole as quickly as she can dig, forcing her to work rapidly to place the barrels and cover them before the site becomes completely waterlogged. The peat itself has a distinctive texture and smell, organic but not quite earthy, with a slightly sweet odor of decomposition that is not unpleasant but distinctly different from ordinary soil. Medieval people understood that bogs were different from other environments, but they could not comprehend the specific conditions that make bog burial an effective preservation technique. The combination of low temperature, high acidity, and lack of oxygen creates an environment where the bacteria responsible for food spoilage cannot survive. The acidic bog water, with a pH level comparable to vinegar, actively inhibits bacterial growth, while the cold temperatures slow all biological processes to a crawl. The lack of oxygen prevents the aerobic decomposition that destroys most buried organic matter. As Adelheid lowers her barrels into the dark, cold embrace of the bog, she performs a ritual that connects her to generations of women who faced similar preservation challenges. Archaeological evidence suggests that bog burial of dairy products was practiced throughout northern Europe for over 1,000 years, with caches of preserved butter dating back to the Iron Age still being discovered by modern peat cutters. The marking of burial sites requires careful consideration of both secrecy and future accessibility. Adelheid cannot create obvious markers that would attract attention from potential thieves or tax collectors, but she must also ensure that she can relocate her buried butter when winter food shortages make its recovery essential. She uses a combination of natural landmarks and subtle markers known only to her family, creating a mental map that she memorizes with the intensity of a military campaign. The psychological impact of burying food represents a fundamental shift in her relationship with preservation. Traditional storage methods, however imperfect, allowed her to monitor her food supplies, to check for signs of spoilage, and to make decisions about consumption based on observed conditions. Bog burial requires a leap of faith that transforms food preservation from active management to passive hope. Once the butter disappears beneath the dark water of the bog, she can only wait and pray that the ancient techniques will prove more reliable than her failed attempts at conventional preservation. The waiting period becomes a form of psychological torture unique to bog burial preservation. Unlike traditionally stored food, which can be checked and monitored, bog-buried butter exists in a state of quantum uncertainty. It might be perfectly preserved, maintaining its nutritional value and wholesome flavor indefinitely, or it might be slowly decomposing beneath the water, becoming inedible waste that cannot be detected until the moment of recovery. The uncertainty gnaws at Adelaide's peace of mind, creating anxiety that permeates every aspect of her daily routine. Medieval communities that practiced bog burial developed elaborate protocols for sharing information about successful techniques. While maintaining secrecy about specific burial locations, women would speak in coded language about sending food to sleep in the cold ground or letting the old mothers take care of the winter supplies. These euphemisms served both to preserve valuable knowledge and to protect burial sites from discovery by unauthorized persons. The seasonal timing of bog burial creates additional complications for medieval preservation strategies. The optimal time for burial is late summer, when bog water levels are lowest and access is easiest, but this timing conflicts with the peak period for butter production and the immediate need for food processing. Adelheid must balance the urgent demands of current production against the long-term benefits of bog preservation, making decisions about resource allocation that will determine her family's survival prospects for the entire winter. As autumn progresses and the first frosts begin to appear, Adelheid finds herself making frequent trips to the bog, not to disturb her buried butter, but to monitor the conditions that might affect its preservation. She observes changes in water levels, notes the formation of ice crusts that might indicate temperature fluctuations, and watches for signs of animal activity that might threaten her buried supplies. These monitoring visits provide some psychological relief from the anxiety of uncertainty, but they also consume time and energy that are desperately needed for other preservation tasks. The social implications of bog burial extend beyond individual food security to community relationships and social standing. Families known to practice bog burial are viewed with a mixture of respect and suspicion by their neighbors. Respect because the technique requires knowledge, skill, and courage that not everyone possesses. Suspicion because the secretive nature of bog burial creates opportunities for hoarding that violate community norms about sharing resources during times of scarcity. Medieval social structures depended on transparency and mutual obligation to function effectively during periods of food shortage. Families were expected to share their preserved food with less fortunate neighbors, to contribute to community stores that supported the elderly and infirm, and to participate in collective strategies for surviving difficult seasons. Bog burial, by its very nature, removes food from these social networks, creating hidden reserves that cannot be monitored or shared according to community expectations. The technical challenges of bog burial become more apparent as Adelheid gains experience with the technique. The depth of burial must be sufficient to ensure stable temperatures and protection from surface disturbances, but not so deep that recovery becomes impossible. The selection of burial sites requires understanding of bog hydrology that is typically gained only through years of observation and occasional catastrophic failures. The timing of burial and recovery must account for seasonal changes in bog conditions that can make access impossible during certain periods. Each buried cache represents not just preserved food, but a complex gamble against environmental conditions that remain largely unpredictable. Unusual weather patterns can alter bog water levels in ways that affect preservation conditions. Extended periods of freezing can make recovery impossible until spring thaw. Conversely, unusually wet seasons can flood burial sites and potentially contaminate stored food with bog water that carries its own risks of bacterial contamination. As winter deepens and Adelheid's conventionally stored food supplies dwindle, according to her worst fears, the moment approaches when she must test the effectiveness of bog burial by recovering her first cache. The decision about when to attempt recovery requires careful consideration of both immediate need and optimal preservation conditions. Recovering the butter too early might interrupt preservation processes that require more time to complete. Waiting too long might expose her family to malnutrition during the period when bog burial provides their only reliable food source. The night before her planned recovery expedition, Adelheid lies awake contemplating the possibility that her bog burial experiment has failed, that she will uncover barrels of ruined butter that represent not just wasted food, but wasted hope. The thought of opening a barrel to find the same putrid mass that destroyed her earlier preservation efforts fills her with dread that goes beyond simple disappointment to touch the deepest fears about survival and security that define medieval existence. But what choice does she have except to trust in techniques that are older than Christianity, older than written records, older than any human institution she knows? The bog has preserved plant matter for thousands of years, creating the peat that heats her home and the distinctive environment that might preserve her butter. If the ancient wisdom proves true, her family will survive the winter with adequate nutrition. If it proves false, they will face the hungry months with dangerously reduced food supplies and the knowledge that their survival depends on techniques that have already failed them once. On a grey morning in early March, when the bog ice has finally softened enough to allow recovery operations, but winter hunger has reduced Adelheid's family to eating bread made from acorn flour and drinking watery gruel that barely qualifies. As soup, she makes the treacherous journey to uncover her buried butter. The bog appears different in the dying days of winter, more forbidding, more alien, with wisps of mist rising from patches of open water and ice formations that create an almost supernatural landscape of twisted shapes and hidden dangers. The recovery process proves even more challenging than the original burial had been. The bog water, partially frozen and stirred by winter storms, has shifted the peat layers and altered the landscape markers that Adelheid had used to identify her burial sites. What had seemed like easily recognizable landmarks in the warmth of late summer now appear as anonymous humps of frozen earth that could conceal anything or nothing. She spends 2 hours probing the frozen ground with a wooden staff, searching for the subtle signs that might indicate the presence of buried barrels. When she finally locates the first cache, the effort required to excavate it through layers of ice and frozen peat pushes her already weakened body to its limits. Medieval winter malnutrition has taken its toll on her strength and endurance, and the physical demands of digging through bog ice with primitive tools leaves her gasping and trembling with exhaustion. Each shovelful of frozen peat feels impossibly heavy, and the bog water that seeps into the excavation site threatens to freeze her hands beyond functional use. The moment of truth arrives when her wooden spade strikes the top of the first buried barrel with a hollow thunk that sends vibrations through the frozen bog. Adelheid's heart pounds with anxiety that has been building for 6 months as she clears the remaining ice and peat from around the container. The barrel appears intact, with no obvious signs of damage or contamination, but its contents remain a mystery that will be resolved only when she breaks the seal and confronts whatever the bog has done to her carefully preserved butter. She lifts the barrel from its icy grave with hands that shake from both cold and anticipation. The container feels heavier than she remembered, which could indicate either preserved butter or water infiltration that has ruined everything inside. The wooden staves show signs of bog water staining, but no evidence of structural failure. The metal hoops that bind the barrel remain tight and secure. By external appearance, the bog burial appears to have been successful, but appearances have deceived her before. The journey back to her cottage becomes a procession of barely controlled terror. Every step across the unstable bog surface threatens to send her plunging into ice water that would be instantly fatal in her weakened condition. The weight of the barrel, combined with her reduced strength from months of inadequate nutrition, forces her to stop and rest every few dozen yards. The bog mist seems to thicken around her, creating an atmosphere of otherworldly isolation that makes the familiar landscape appear foreign and threatening. Back in the relative safety of her dairy house, Adelheid faces the barrel with the mixture of hope and dread that has become characteristic of her relationship with food preservation. The success or failure of bog burial will determine not just her family's immediate survival, but their confidence in preservation techniques that might be needed again in future years of crisis. If the bog has preserved her butter, she will have discovered a method that could revolutionize her family's approach to food security. If it has failed, she will have lost precious resources at the moment when they are most desperately needed. The barrel opens with surprising ease, the wooden
lid lifting away to reveal contents that take her breath away with their perfection.
The butter lies beneath a protective layer of crystallized salt and rendered fat, its surface showing the rich golden color that indicates not just preservation, but enhancement through the bog's mysterious chemistry. The smell that rises from the opened container is not the expected mustiness of bog water or the feared stench of spoilage, but the clean, sweet aroma of butter that seems fresher than when it was first buried. As she lifts the first handful of bog-preserved butter, Adelheid realizes that she is witnessing something that approaches the miraculous. The texture is perfect, firm but not hard, smooth without being greasy, exactly as butter should be after proper preservation. The color has deepened from the pale yellow of fresh butter to a rich gold that suggests concentration and improvement rather than deterioration. When she tastes it cautiously, the flavor is not just preserved but enhanced with subtle notes that remind her of herbs and flowers, despite the fact that no such ingredients were added during the preservation process. The bog has worked a transformation that medieval people would have attributed to magic, but that modern science would recognize as the result of specific chemical processes unique to bog environments. The acidic conditions have prevented bacterial spoilage while allowing beneficial chemical reactions that actually improve the butter's flavor and texture. The cold temperatures have slowed all deterioration processes to the point where time itself seems to have been suspended. The anaerobic environment has prevented the oxidation that causes rancidity in conventionally stored butter. The quantity of preserved butter exceeds her most optimistic expectations. What had been 12 pounds of butter when buried has somehow become 14 pounds of perfectly preserved, even improved dairy product. The increase appears to result from the concentration of moisture and the absorption of beneficial minerals from the bog environment. Every pound represents not just nutrition but a small miracle of preservation that has literally saved her family from the malnutrition that threatens so many medieval households during the late winter months. The psychological impact of this success transforms Adelheid's understanding of food preservation from desperate gamble to reliable technique. The anxiety that has dominated her thoughts throughout the winter gives way to confidence that she has mastered a preservation method that could provide food security for years to come. The knowledge that bog burial works reliably changes her entire approach to dairy production, allowing her to plan for much longer storage periods and greater quantities of preserved food. The recovery of additional caches over the following days confirms the consistent effectiveness of bog burial. Each barrel contains butter that has been perfectly preserved, with some showing even greater improvement in flavor and texture than the first. The total recovery amounts to nearly 50 pounds of butter that is not just edible but delicious, representing more preserved dairy product than Adelheid had produced in any previous year using conventional techniques. The social implications of her success create new challenges as word spreads through the village about her bog burial achievements. Neighbors who had viewed her experiment with skepticism now seek her advice about their own preservation problems. The knowledge that she possesses becomes a form of currency that must be shared carefully to avoid creating either dependence or competition that could threaten her family's food security. Medieval communities operated on delicate balances of cooperation and competition that were disrupted when one family achieved significantly greater success than their neighbors. Adelheid must navigate the social expectations that require her to share knowledge while protecting the specific information that ensures her family's survival advantage. The bog burial sites themselves become valuable resources that must be guarded against both discovery and overuse. The technical aspects of bog burial that Adelheid has mastered through trial and error represent knowledge that could benefit the entire community, but they also represent competitive advantages that her family cannot afford to surrender completely. She begins to develop a teaching strategy that shares general principles while protecting specific details, allowing neighbors to benefit from bog burial techniques without compromising her family's exclusive access to the most effective burial sites. As spring progresses and fresh food becomes available again, Adelheid finds herself in the unprecedented position of having surplus preserved butter that extends her food security well beyond the traditional seasonal cycle. The success of bog burial has transformed her family's relationship with food storage from constant anxiety about adequacy to careful planning about optimal utilization of abundance. For the first time in her adult life, she faces the challenge of managing surplus rather than scarcity. The bog-preserved butter proves to have storage characteristics that extend far beyond even her most optimistic expectations. Portions that remain unopened continue to improve in flavor and texture, suggesting that the bog environment creates preservation conditions that actually enhance food quality over time rather than merely preventing deterioration. This discovery opens possibilities for long-term food storage that could span multiple years rather than single seasons. As she contemplates the implications of her bog burial success, Adelheid realizes that she has stumbled upon a preservation technique that could fundamentally alter the survival strategies available to medieval families. The knowledge she has gained represents not just personal advantage, but potential contribution to human understanding of food preservation that could benefit generations to come. The question now is how to use this knowledge responsibly while ensuring that her own family's food security remains protected against the uncertainties that continue to characterize medieval life. In the bustling market square of Rouen in the year 1302, a single pound of high-quality butter commands a price that would purchase 4 pounds of bread, 2 gallons of ale, or a day's wages for a skilled craftsman. This extraordinary value reflects not just the labor required to produce butter, but its role as one of the most important economic commodities in medieval Europe. As Brother Guillaume, the monastery's treasurer, carefully counts out silver deniers to purchase the week's butter supply, he participates in an economic system that has elevated this humble dairy product to the status of edible currency. The economic importance of butter in medieval society extends far beyond its nutritional value or culinary applications. In regions of Northern Europe where olive oil is unavailable and animal fats are scarce, butter serves as the primary cooking medium, the essential ingredient for food preservation, and one of the few reliable sources of concentrated calories during winter months. This combination of necessity and scarcity has created market conditions that make butter production one of the most profitable agricultural activities available to medieval peasants. Brother Guillaume represents the institutional demand that drives butter markets throughout medieval Europe. The monastery of St. Ouen, with its community of 60 monks plus lay brothers, servants, and regular visitors, consumes approximately 15 pounds of butter per week during peak season. This consumption includes not just direct dietary use, but the butter required for cooking, food preservation, and the production of specialty items like illuminated manuscripts, where butter serves as a component in certain pigments and binding agents. The price volatility of butter markets creates both opportunities and risks that medieval merchants have learned to navigate with sophisticated trading strategies. During peak production season in late summer, when dairy output reaches its maximum and storage problems create pressure for immediate sale, butter prices can fall to half their winter levels. Conversely, during the lean months of late winter and early spring, when stored supplies run low and fresh production has not yet begun, butter prices can reach levels that make it accessible only to the wealthy. This seasonal price variation has created a class of butter merchants who specialize in buying surplus production during peak season and storing it for sale during periods of scarcity. These merchants, operating with capital that allows them to purchase and hold inventory for months at a time, serve an essential economic function by smoothing supply fluctuations and ensuring that butter remains available throughout the year. However, their activities also introduce speculative elements into butter markets that can drive prices beyond the reach of ordinary consumers during times of greatest need. The standardization of butter weights and measures represents one of the earliest examples of consumer protection regulation in medieval commerce. The guilds that govern butter trade in major cities have established precise standards for butter quality, purity, and weight that merchants must meet to participate in authorized markets. These standards include requirements for salt content, moisture levels, color consistency, and the absence of adulterants that unscrupulous producers might use to increase weight or volume at the expense of nutritional value. The enforcement of these standards requires sophisticated inspection procedures that medieval guilds have developed through centuries of experience with food fraud. Guild inspectors examine butter samples for texture, smell, and taste that indicate proper production methods and storage conditions. They test for adulterants like chalk, which can be mixed with butter to increase weight, or inferior fats that might be substituted for genuine dairy butter. Merchants found guilty of selling substandard or adulterated butter face penalties that can include exclusion from guild membership and prohibition from butter trading activities. The geographic distribution of butter production and consumption has created trade networks that span the European continent and generate enormous quantities of wealth for the regions that specialize in dairy agriculture. The Low Countries, with their rich pastures and advanced dairy techniques, export butter throughout northern Europe and into the Mediterranean regions where local production is insufficient to meet demand. These exports generate foreign currency that supports the development of other industries and creates prosperity that extends far beyond the agricultural sector. The taxation of butter production and trade provides significant revenue for both secular and religious authorities throughout medieval Europe. Peasant families typically owe their feudal lords a portion of their butter production as part of their rental obligations, while butter merchants pay taxes on their trade activities that help fund the administration of medieval governments. The monastery of Saint Ouen, for example, collects butter tithes from the surrounding countryside that represent approximately 10% of total local production. The accounting systems that medieval institutions use to track butter transactions demonstrate sophisticated understanding of commodity economics that rivals modern financial practices. Brother Guillaume maintains detailed records of butter purchases that include information about suppliers, quality grades, seasonal price variations, and consumption patterns that allow the monastery to optimize its purchasing strategies. These records, preserved in monastery archives, provide modern historians with invaluable insight into the economic importance of butter in medieval society. The credit systems that facilitate butter trade represent some of the earliest forms of commercial finance in medieval Europe. Butter merchants routinely extend credit to institutional customers like monasteries, allowing them to purchase butter during high-price periods with payment deferred until harvest time when cash flow improves. These credit arrangements require sophisticated assessment of creditworthiness and risk management that have contributed to the development of banking practices that continue to influence modern finance. The labor economics of butter production reveal the complex relationship between agricultural work and monetary value in medieval society. A skilled dairymaid like Agnes can produce approximately 12 pounds of butter per week during peak season, representing labor value equivalent to several weeks' wages for less skilled workers. This productivity differential helps explain why dairy work, despite its physical demands and social restrictions, attracted women who sought to maximize their economic contributions to household survival. The international trade in butter has created diplomatic relationships and commercial alliances that extend far beyond simple commodity exchange. The famous Butter Tower of Rouen Cathedral, financed entirely through church fees paid by wealthy citizens who wanted permission to eat butter during Lent, represents just one example of how butter economics influenced religious, political, and architectural developments throughout medieval Europe. The quality differentiation that characterizes medieval butter markets demonstrates consumer sophistication that challenges stereotypes about medieval food culture. Premium butter, produced by skilled dairymaids using optimal techniques and high-quality milk, commands prices that are significantly higher than standard grades. This quality premium reflects not just superior taste and texture, but longer storage, life, better cooking properties, and enhanced nutritional value that justify the additional cost for consumers who can afford it. The seasonal employment patterns created by butter production contribute to the complex labor dynamics that characterize medieval agricultural communities. During peak production season, dairy operations require additional workers for milking, cream processing, and butter production that cannot be performed by household members alone. This seasonal demand creates employment opportunities for landless laborers and supplemental income for families whose primary agricultural activities do not provide adequate year-round support. The technological innovations that improve butter production efficiency represent significant capital investments that generate returns through improved productivity and product quality. Advanced churning equipment, specialized storage facilities, and improved preservation techniques require financial resources that are available only to prosperous dairy operations, creating competitive advantages that can be sustained over multiple production seasons. As Brother Guillaume completes his weekly butter purchases and returns to the monastery with his precious cargo, he carries with him not just food, but liquid wealth that will sustain his community through another week of medieval life. The silver coins he has exchanged for butter represent the intersection of agriculture, commerce, technology, and finance that makes butter one of the most economically significant commodities in medieval Europe. But how did this humble dairy product achieve such extraordinary economic importance, and what does its value reveal about the broader structure of medieval society? The butter merchants of Rouen have gathered in their guild hall on this foggy November morning in 1304 to address a crisis that threatens to destabilize the entire regional dairy economy. Word has arrived from Flanders that a consortium of wealthy cloth merchants has begun purchasing butter in unprecedented quantities, not for consumption, but as a commodity investment designed to corner the market and drive prices to levels that will generate enormous profits while potentially creating famine conditions for ordinary consumers. This development represents a new form of economic warfare that transforms butter from a food commodity into a weapon of financial speculation. Guildmaster Henri de Beaumont stands before the assembled merchants with ledgers that document the alarming trends in butter trading over the past 6 months. Purchases by non-traditional buyers have increased by over 300%, while the volume of butter available for normal commercial sale has decreased by nearly half. The price of premium butter has risen from 8 deniers per pound to 22 deniers per pound, placing it beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest consumers and creating genuine hardship for institutions like monasteries, hospitals, and charitable organizations that depend on butter for their basic operations. The Flemish speculation strategy represents a sophisticated understanding of butter economics that exploits the fundamental characteristics of medieval dairy production. Unlike grain crops, which can be stored for years under proper conditions, or livestock, which can be slaughtered and processed when market conditions are favorable, butter production is locked into seasonal cycles that cannot be altered by human intervention. Dairy cows produce milk only during specific months, cream cannot be preserved indefinitely before churning, and butter itself has limited storage life even under optimal preservation conditions. These constraints create opportunities for market manipulation that do not exist with other agricultural commodities. Investors who purchase large quantities of butter during peak production season can create artificial scarcity during winter months when fresh production is impossible and stored. Supplies become critical for survival. The physical limitations of butter storage mean that cornering the market requires relatively modest capital investments compared to similar speculation in grain or textile commodities. The human cost of butter speculation becomes apparent as Henry reads reports from smaller towns throughout the region where butter shortages have already begun to affect public health. The monastery of St. Wandril has reduced its butter consumption by 60%, forcing changes in meal preparation that have led to nutritional deficiencies among the elderly monks. The municipal hospital in Caen has suspended butter distribution to indigent patients, eliminating one of their few sources of concentrated calories during the critical winter months. The technical aspects of large-scale butter storage present logistical challenges that the Flemish speculators have apparently solved through investments in specialized preservation facilities. Reports indicate that they have constructed underground storage chambers lined with stone and maintained at constant cool temperatures through sophisticated ventilation systems. These facilities represent capital investments of thousands of pounds that are recoverable only through massive profits from artificial price manipulation. The Guild's response to this crisis must balance several competing concerns that reflect the complex relationships between commerce, politics, and social responsibility in medieval society. As representatives of established butter merchants, they have professional interests in maintaining orderly markets and preventing speculation that could damage long-term trading relationships. As residents of communities affected by artificial scarcity, they have moral obligations to ensure that essential food supplies remain accessible to ordinary consumers. The legal framework governing commodity speculation in medieval Europe provides limited tools for addressing market manipulation, particularly when the speculation involves merchants from different jurisdictions. The Flemish speculators operate under the commercial laws of their own cities, which may not recognize the authority of Rouen guild regulations or Norman legal precedents. International commercial disputes typically require resolution through diplomatic channels that are slow, expensive, and uncertain in their outcomes. The Guild's investigation reveals the sophisticated network of agents and intermediaries that the Flemish consortium has deployed throughout the butter-producing regions of northern France. These agents, operating with substantial financial resources, have systematically approached dairy producers with offers to purchase their entire seasonal output at prices significantly above normal market rates. While these transactions appear beneficial to individual producers, their aggregate effect has been to remove enormous quantities of butter from normal commercial channels. The economic impact of butter speculation extends far beyond the dairy industry to affect numerous related sectors of the medieval economy. Restaurants and taverns that depend on butter for food preparation have been forced to raise prices or modify their menus in ways that reduce their competitiveness. Bakeries that use butter in their premium products face choices between accepting reduced profit margins, or pricing their goods beyond the reach of traditional customers. The regional implications of the butter crisis have attracted attention from political authorities who recognize that food shortages can quickly escalate into civil unrest that threatens public order. The Count of Normandy has received petitions from multiple towns requesting intervention to ensure adequate butter supplies for the coming winter. These petitions document specific cases of hardship and provide detailed evidence of price manipulation that could justify regulatory action under existing commercial law. The Guild's response strategy involves both immediate tactical measures and longer-term structural reforms designed to prevent similar speculation in the future. The immediate tactics include coordinated purchasing agreements among Guild members that will concentrate their buying power and reduce competition that benefits speculators. The structural reforms include proposals for maximum price regulations, mandatory reserve requirements for butter merchants, and improved coordination with guilds in other cities to prevent cross-border market manipulation. The theological dimensions of butter speculation have drawn criticism from church authorities who view artificial food scarcity as a form of sin that violates Christian principles of charity and social responsibility. Bishop Robert of Rouen has issued pastoral letters condemning speculation in essential commodities and threatening excommunication for merchants who create artificial famines for personal profit. These religious sanctions carry significant social and economic consequences in a society where church membership is essential for participation in commercial activities. The technological innovations that support large-scale butter storage represent significant advances in medieval food preservation that could have beneficial applications if used for social good rather than market manipulation. The underground storage facilities developed by the Flemish speculators demonstrate engineering techniques that could be adapted to create community food reserves that would provide security against natural shortages rather than artificial ones. The international nature of the butter speculation crisis reveals the extent to which medieval European economies had become interconnected through trade networks that spanned multiple kingdoms and commercial jurisdictions. The ability of Flemish merchants to manipulate butter markets in Normandy demonstrates the emergence of continental economic systems that operate beyond the control of local political authorities and traditional guild regulations. The Guild's efforts to document the scope and impact of butter speculation produce detailed records that provide unprecedented insight into medieval commodity markets and the sophisticated financial instruments that merchants developed to manage risk and maximize profit. These records include contracts, price lists, shipping manifests, and correspondence that reveal the complexity of medieval commercial operations and the advanced understanding of market dynamics that successful merchants possessed. The social stratification that results from butter price manipulation illustrates the broader patterns of inequality that characterize medieval society. Wealthy households that can afford butter at any price continue to consume it at normal levels, while middle-class families reduce their consumption and poor families eliminate butter from their diets entirely. This distribution of economic hardship according to social class reinforces existing hierarchies and creates resentment that can have long-term political consequences. As the guild meeting progresses and the full scope of the butter crisis becomes apparent, Henri and his fellow merchants face decisions that will determine not just their individual business prospects, but the broader structure of commodity markets throughout medieval Europe. Their response to speculation will establish precedents for dealing with similar crises in other essential commodities and will influence the development of commercial law and guild regulations for generations to come. The stakes could not be higher. The survival of traditional butter markets, the food security of ordinary consumers, and the integrity of commercial systems that balance profit motives with social responsibility. The decisions made in this foggy guild hall will ripple through the medieval economy and shape the evolution of European commerce in ways that extend far beyond the immediate crisis of butter speculation. By the spring of 1305, the butter wars have transformed from a commercial dispute into a continental crisis that reaches the highest levels of medieval government and threatens to reshape the fundamental structure of European trade. King Philip IV of France has convened a royal commission to investigate commodity speculation. Pope Clement V has issued papal bulls condemning artificial food scarcity, and the Holy Roman Emperor has proposed international treaties to regulate cross-border trade in essential commodities. The humble dairy product that began as sustenance for medieval peasants has become the catalyst for economic reforms that will influence European commerce for centuries to come. The immediate trigger for royal intervention came when butter shortages contributed to food riots in Paris that left 12 people dead and dozens injured. The violence erupted when urban consumers, faced with butter prices that had increased by over 400% in 6 months, attempted to storm the warehouses where Flemish speculators had stored enormous quantities of the precious commodity. The sight of armed guards protecting stockpiles of butter while ordinary citizens went without essential nutrition created a symbolic representation of economic injustice that resonated throughout medieval society. King Philip's Royal Commission has uncovered evidence of speculation networks that extend far beyond butter to include other essential commodities like salt, wool, and grain. The investigation reveals sophisticated financial instruments that medieval merchants developed to coordinate market manipulation across multiple regions and commodity types. These instruments include futures contracts that lock in prices for goods not yet produced, insurance policies that protect speculators against losses from market intervention, and complex partnership agreements that distribute profits and risks among multiple investors. The scale of capital involved in commodity speculation has surprised even experienced royal administrators who thought they understood the financial resources available to medieval merchants. The Flemish consortium alone has invested over £50,000 in butter speculation, representing wealth equivalent to the annual tax revenue of several small kingdoms. This concentration of capital in private hands has created economic power that rivals that of political authorities and challenges traditional assumptions about the relationship between commerce and governance. The papal response to the butter crisis reflects broader church concerns about the moral implications of profit-seeking behavior that creates suffering for ordinary Christians. Pope Clement's bulls specifically condemn speculation that transforms the gifts of God's creation into instruments of avarice that deny sustenance to the faithful. The religious authority mobilized against commodity speculation includes not just moral condemnation, but practical sanctions like exclusion from sacraments and prohibition from church burial that carry significant social consequences in medieval society. The economic analysis produced by royal investigators reveals the sophisticated understanding of market dynamics that successful speculators possess. Their strategy exploited not just the seasonal nature of butter production, but the complex web of dependencies that connect dairy agriculture to other sectors of the medieval economy. By controlling butter supplies, they gained leverage over restaurants, bakeries, monasteries, hospitals, and wealthy households that depend on butter for their normal operations. The international dimensions of the butter crisis have created diplomatic tensions between France and Flanders that extend far beyond commercial disputes to touch questions of sovereignty and territorial control. The Flemish merchants operate under the protection of their own political authorities, who benefit from the wealth generated by successful speculation and resist French attempts to regulate or punish their citizens' commercial activities. This jurisdictional conflict has escalated to the point where military intervention remains a possibility if diplomatic solutions cannot be found. The technological innovations developed to support large-scale butter storage have attracted attention from royal engineers who recognize their potential applications for military logistics and famine relief. The underground storage facilities, refrigeration techniques, and preservation methods pioneered by speculators could be adapted to create strategic food reserves that would enhance national security and reduce vulnerability to natural disasters or enemy blockades. The guild system that traditionally regulated medieval commerce has proven inadequate to address speculation that operates across multiple jurisdictions and involves capital resources that exceed the financial capacity of individual guilds. The butter crisis has exposed fundamental limitations in local regulation of international commerce and has accelerated discussions about continental approaches to commercial law that would provide consistent standards and enforcement mechanisms across political boundaries. The social consequences of butter speculation have created lasting changes in medieval attitudes toward commerce and profit that extend far beyond the immediate crisis. The sight of wealthy merchants profiting from artificial food scarcity while ordinary people suffered has generated popular resentment toward commercial activities that was previously directed primarily toward tax collectors and political authorities. This shift in public opinion has political implications that concern both commercial and governmental leaders. The economic lessons learned from the butter crisis have influenced the development of new financial instruments and regulatory mechanisms that will shape European commerce for centuries. The recognition that commodity speculation can destabilize entire economies has led to proposals for price controls, strategic reserves, and international coordination that represent significant advances in economic policy. These innovations reflect growing understanding of market dynamics and the need for institutional frameworks that balance commercial freedom with social stability. The resolution of the butter crisis ultimately requires a combination of regulatory intervention, diplomatic negotiation, and market adaptation that establishes new precedents for dealing with commodity speculation. The Royal Commission's final recommendations include mandatory reporting requirements for large commodity transactions, maximum price regulations for essential goods, and international treaties that facilitate coordination between different political jurisdictions in addressing cross-border speculation. The long-term impact of the butter wars extends far beyond the immediate resolution of artificial scarcity to influence the fundamental structure of European economic development. The crisis has demonstrated both the potential benefits and dangers of market-based resource allocation, leading to more sophisticated understanding of the need for institutional frameworks that can harness commercial energy while preventing its abuse. The transformation of butter from humble food product to instrument of economic warfare illustrates the broader changes occurring in medieval society as commercial relationships become more complex and international in scope. The same trade networks that enable beneficial exchange of goods and services also create opportunities for manipulation and exploitation that require new forms of regulation and international cooperation. As spring arrives and fresh butter production begins to alleviate the artificial shortages created by speculation, the immediate crisis subsides, but its lessons remain embedded in the institutional memory of European commerce. The butter wars have revealed both the sophistication of medieval economic systems and their vulnerability to manipulation by actors who possess sufficient capital and organizational capability to exploit systemic weaknesses. The medieval people who lived through the butter crisis could not have imagined that their struggles with food speculation would contribute to the development of economic institutions and regulatory frameworks that continue to influence global commerce in the modern era. Their suffering and their responses to artificial scarcity created precedents and established principles that remain relevant to contemporary discussions about market regulation, international trade, and the balance between commercial freedom and social responsibility. The yellow gold that caused so much conflict and created so much innovation ultimately taught medieval society lessons about economics, politics, and human nature that transformed European civilization in ways that extended far beyond the dairy industry. The butter that required such back-breaking labor to produce, such ingenious techniques to preserve, and such sophisticated networks to distribute, had become a mirror reflecting the entire structure of medieval society, its inequalities, its innovations, its struggles, and its capacity for both cooperation and exploitation. The final accounting of the Butter Wars reveals statistics that illuminate the true scope of this medieval economic crisis. Over the 18 months of intensive speculation, approximately 200,000 pounds of butter were removed from normal commercial channels and held in storage facilities across Flanders and northern France. This represented nearly 40% of the total butter production in the affected regions, creating artificial scarcity that drove prices to levels that made butter inaccessible to an estimated 300,000 people who had previously relied on it. As a dietary staple, the human cost of this speculation extends beyond simple inconvenience to documented cases of malnutrition, particularly among children and elderly individuals whose diets depended heavily on the concentrated calories and essential fatty acids that butter provided. Hospital records from Rouen, Caen, and other affected cities show increased mortality rates during the winter of 1304 to 1305 that correlate directly with the period of maximum butter scarcity and highest prices. Yet the crisis also catalyzed innovations that ultimately improved food security for ordinary medieval people. The storage techniques developed by speculators were adapted by municipal authorities to create public food reserves that could be maintained during times of abundance and distributed during periods of natural scarcity. The preservation methods pioneered for large-scale butter storage found applications in the storage of other perishable foods, reducing waste and extending the availability of nutritious food throughout the year. The regulatory frameworks established in response to the butter crisis created precedents for government intervention in commodity markets that would influence European economic development for centuries. The concept of essential commodities that required special protection from speculation evolved into comprehensive food security policies that recognized the government's responsibility to ensure adequate nutrition for its citizens. These policies represented a fundamental shift from medieval assumptions about the purely private nature of commercial transactions toward more modern concepts of public interest in market outcomes. The international cooperation required to address cross-border speculation led to the development of commercial treaties and diplomatic mechanisms that facilitated trade while preventing its abuse. The butter crisis demonstrated that medieval European economies had become sufficiently interconnected that purely local regulation was inadequate to address economic problems that spanned multiple kingdoms and jurisdictions. This recognition accelerated the development of international commercial law and diplomatic institutions that would eventually evolve into modern systems of international economic governance. The social consequences of the butter wars included lasting changes in medieval attitudes toward wealth, commerce, and social responsibility that would influence European culture for generations. The sight of merchants profiting from artificial food scarcity while ordinary people suffered created popular resentment toward purely profit-driven commercial behavior that had previously been accepted as natural and inevitable. This shift in public opinion contributed to the development of ethical frameworks for commercial behavior that emphasized social responsibility alongside profit maximization. The technological innovations spurred by the butter crisis extended far beyond food preservation to influence medieval engineering, architecture, and industrial development. The underground storage facilities developed for butter preservation demonstrated construction techniques that were applied to the building of foundations, sewage systems, and defensive fortifications. The ventilation systems created to maintain optimal storage conditions influenced the development of heating and cooling systems for residential and commercial buildings. The financial instruments created to support large-scale commodity speculation contributed to the development of medieval banking and investment practices that would eventually evolve into modern financial systems. The futures contracts, insurance policies, and partnership agreements pioneered during the Butter Wars established legal and commercial precedents that facilitated the growth of more sophisticated financial markets throughout Europe. The documentation produced during the investigation of butter speculation provides modern historians with unprecedented insight into medieval economic systems and the sophisticated understanding of market dynamics that medieval merchants possessed. The detailed records of prices, quantities, storage methods, and trading relationships reveal levels of commercial sophistication that challenge traditional assumptions about medieval economic development and demonstrate the continuity between medieval and modern commercial practices. The educational impact of the butter crisis influenced the development of medieval universities and the curriculum of commercial education that prepared future generations of merchants, administrators, and political leaders. The recognition that commodity markets could have profound social and political consequences led to increased emphasis on economic education and the development of more sophisticated analytical frameworks for understanding commercial behavior and its broader implications. The cultural legacy of the Butter Wars includes their incorporation into medieval literature, folklore, and popular culture in ways that preserved lessons about economic justice and social responsibility for future generations. Stories about the butter crisis became cautionary tales about the dangers of greed and the importance of community solidarity that were transmitted through oral tradition and written narratives throughout medieval Europe. The resolution of the butter crisis required the development of enforcement mechanisms that could monitor compliance with new regulations and punish violations effectively. The creation of commercial courts, inspection systems, and penalty structures established institutional frameworks for economic regulation that would evolve into modern systems of commercial law and business regulation. The long-term economic impact of the Butter Wars included the establishment of more stable and equitable commodity markets that balanced commercial freedom with social protection. The regulatory innovations developed in response to the crisis created market conditions that encouraged productive investment while discouraging purely speculative behavior that created social costs without corresponding benefits. As the immediate crisis faded and normal butter production resumed, the medieval people who had lived through the Butter Wars found themselves inhabiting a world that had been fundamentally changed by their experience. The economic institutions, regulatory frameworks, and social attitudes that emerged from the crisis would shape European development for centuries and contribute to the evolution of economic systems that continue to influence global commerce. In the modern era, the four women whose stories have been told, Agnes with her dawn chorus of dairy work, Margaret with her marathon churning sessions, Adelheid with her desperate bog burial experiments, and the countless unnamed dairymaids whose labor supported the entire butter economy, represent the human foundation upon which this remarkable economic transformation was built. Their tears, their aching arms, their desperate prayers, and their ingenious solutions created the wealth that financed medieval civilization and the innovations that advanced human knowledge of food production and preservation. The butter that cost them so much to produce ultimately purchased more than sustenance. It brought progress, innovation, and social development that transformed medieval Europe and laid the groundwork for the modern world. Their suffering was real, their labor was backbreaking, and their challenges were often insurmountable, but their efforts created something larger than themselves, an economic system sophisticated enough to support the growth of cities, the development of learning, and the advancement of human civilization. The medieval world that demanded such sacrifice from its dairy workers ultimately rewarded their efforts with innovations in technology, governance, and social organization that improved life for future generations. The tears shed over churning butter became the foundation for prosperity that extended far beyond the dairy houses where they were originally spilled, creating wealth that funded universities, cathedrals, and cultural achievements that remain monuments to human ingenuity and determination. In the end, the story of medieval butter production is not just about food or agriculture or even economics. It is about the human capacity to transform suffering into progress, to create abundance from scarcity, and to build civilization through the accumulated efforts of countless individuals who persevered through hardships that would break the spirit of lesser people. The medieval world was indeed a place where you might cry trying to make butter, but it was also a world where those tears watered the seeds of innovations that continue to nourish human civilization today.